The contemporary debate over NATO's strategic posture reflects a broader problem that has long occupied scholars of structural realism: how alliances interpret signals in an environment of uncertainty, and how those interpretations shape long-term power relationships. The issue at hand is not a single decision or statement, but a pattern of inference that appears to have guided NATO's behavior at a critical moment. From a realist perspective, what matters is not intent, but effect. Signals, whether diplomatic, military, or institutional, acquire meaning through the incentives and fears of those interpreting them. When an alliance misreads a signal, the costs are rarely immediate, but they often become embedded in the strategic landscape. NATO's importance derives from its role as a balancing institution. It aggregates the power of its members, reduces coordination problems, and sends deterrent signals to potential adversaries. Its credibility depends less on declarations than on whether its actions align with the underlying distribution of power. In this sense, NATO is not merely a security provider, but a signaling mechanism. The alliance communicates resolve, limits, and expectations, often indirectly. When those signals are misinterpreted, either by NATO itself or by external actors, the resulting dynamics can be difficult to reverse. The signal in question emerged from a period of shifting power balances and institutional adaptation. The post-Cold War environment encouraged NATO to redefine its purpose, expanding membership and broadening its missions. These changes were often justified in liberal terms, but a realist reading emphasizes structural incentives. Expansion increased NATO's aggregate power while simultaneously moving the alliance closer to other major actors' perceived security boundaries. This dual effect created ambiguity. To some observers, expansion suggested defensive reassurance. To others, it indicated encroachment. NATO's internal debates reflected this tension, as members differed in threat perception, strategic culture, and tolerance for risk. From a structural realist standpoint, the critical issue is that NATO appears to have inferred restraint where ambiguity existed. The alliance treated certain external responses as manageable or symbolic, rather than as indicators of deeper insecurity. This interpretation may have been understandable. Power asymmetries, economic interdependence, and institutional dialogue mechanisms all suggested that escalation was unlikely. Yet, realism cautions that states often respond to perceived shifts in the balance of power, even when the material change is modest. What matters is relative position, not absolute capability. Underlying these dynamics were incentives facing both NATO members and external actors. For NATO, maintaining unity required emphasizing consensus and minimizing internal disagreement. This tendency can bias institutions toward optimistic interpretations of external behavior. For other major powers, signaling dissatisfaction or resolve carried relatively low costs in the short term, especially if such signals were calibrated to avoid immediate confrontation. The resulting interaction resembled a classic security dilemma in which defensive measures by one side were interpreted as threatening by another, even if neither sought escalation. Importantly, a realist analysis avoids assigning blame. The misreading of a signal does not imply incompetence or bad faith. Rather, it reflects structural constraints on information and interpretation. Alliances are particularly prone to this problem because they aggregate multiple perspectives and must act on shared assumptions. When those assumptions are flawed, the alliance's collective behavior can drift away from the strategic realities it faces. Why does this matter now? Because signals, once acted upon, shape future options. NATO's interpretation influenced force posture decisions, diplomatic engagement, and expectations about acceptable risk. Over time, these choices narrowed the range of plausible adjustments. What initially appeared reversible became embedded in planning documents, deployment patterns, and political commitments. In realist terms, the alliance altered the strategic environment in ways that constrained both itself and others. The broader implication is that alliances do not merely respond to power distributions, they help constitute them. NATO's strength lies in its ability to coordinate and deter, but that same strength can amplify the consequences of misinterpretation. When an alliance signals confidence based on incomplete information, it may inadvertently encourage counterbalancing behavior. Conversely, when it signals restraint where firmness might have clarified intentions, it may invite testing. Thus, the strategic context is one of locked-in interactions. The misread signal is less important than the feedback loop it initiated. NATO's actions, shaped by its interpretation, influenced external responses, which in turn reinforced the alliance's original assumptions. This dynamic illustrates a central realist insight. International politics is path-dependent. Early interpretations, even if reasonable at the time, can generate long-term costs when they fail to account for how other actors perceive shifts in relative power. Institutional behavior within NATO provides further insight into how the misreading of a signal translated into concrete strategic outcomes. Alliances are not unitary actors. They are coalitions with internal hierarchies, divergent interests, and varying degrees of influence. These internal dynamics shape how information is processed and how responses are formulated. In NATO's case, consensus-based decision-making tends to privilege interpretations that preserve unity, even when alternative readings might suggest higher risk. One consequence of this institutional logic is a tendency toward incrementalism. Rather than reassessing core assumptions, alliances often adjust at the margins. NATO's responses to emerging challenges followed this pattern. Measures were taken to reassure certain members while avoiding actions that might provoke a stronger external reaction. From an internal perspective, this approach appeared prudent. It balanced deterrence with restraint and maintained political cohesion. However, incrementalism can obscure cumulative effects. What appears modest in isolation may look substantial when viewed as part of a longer trajectory. Second-order effects are particularly important in this context. NATO's actions not only affected its immediate security environment, but also altered the calculations of actors beyond the alliance. States observing NATO behavior could interpret incremental moves as evidence of a longer-term strategy, regardless of official statements to the contrary. Structural realism suggests that such observers are likely to focus on capabilities and positioning rather than declared intentions. As a result, even carefully calibrated measures can generate countermeasures. Historical precedents illustrate this dynamic. During the Cold War, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact engaged in signaling that was often misinterpreted by the other side. Episodes such as the deployment of intermediate-range missiles in Europe demonstrated how alliance decisions driven by internal bargaining could escalate tensions despite efforts at reassurance. While the contemporary context differs, the underlying logic remains similar. Alliances act under uncertainty, and their actions can produce unintended consequences when interpreted through a security dilemma lens. Another institutional factor is credibility. NATO's credibility rests on the expectation that its commitments will be honored. This expectation applies both internally and externally. Internally, members must believe that collective defense is reliable. Externally, potential adversaries must believe that NATO will respond to challenges. When the alliance interprets a signal as non-threatening and responds cautiously, it may preserve short-term stability, but at the cost of creating ambiguity about its thresholds. That ambiguity can encourage probing behavior as external actors test the limits of NATO's resolve. Trade-offs are inherent in this process. Stronger signaling can deter, but also provoke. Restraint can reassure, but also invite challenge. NATO's miscalculation, if it can be called that, lay in underestimating how its own internal logic interacted with external perceptions. The alliance appeared to assume that shared institutions and economic ties would dampen security competition. While these factors matter, realism suggests they rarely override concerns about relative power when core interests are at stake. Institutional learning is another relevant dimension. Alliances adapt based on past experiences, but that learning can be biased. Success in managing previous crises may reinforce confidence in existing approaches, even when structural conditions have changed. NATO's post-Cold War experience of expansion without immediate conflict may have contributed to an expectation that further adjustments would be similarly manageable. This expectation, however, did not fully account for changes in relative capabilities, domestic politics, and threat perceptions among key actors. Comparisons to other alliances are instructive. The US-Japan alliance, for example, has faced similar challenges in signaling and adaptation. Incremental changes in force posture and mission scope were often intended as defensive adjustments, but were interpreted by others as part of a broader containment strategy. In each case, the alliance's internal consensus masked external anxieties, leading to strategic friction. Ultimately, NATO's institutional behavior amplified the consequences of the initial signal misreading. Decisions made to preserve unity and avoid escalation had the unintended effect of narrowing strategic options. Once certain postures were adopted and expectations set, reversing course became politically and strategically costly. This is a familiar pattern in alliance politics. Commitments once made create sunk costs that shape future behavior. The key realist insight is that institutions do not eliminate power politics, they mediate it. NATO's structures influenced how signals were interpreted and acted upon, but they could not escape the underlying logic of balancing and counterbalancing. The misreading of a signal thus became embedded in institutional routines, transforming a moment of ambiguity into a durable strategic condition. The long-term implications of NATO's misread signal extend beyond immediate security concerns to the broader architecture of international order. From a realist perspective, credibility and stability are closely linked. When alliances act on flawed interpretations, the resulting adjustments can reshape expectations about power and resolve. These expectations, once established, influence behavior over extended periods, often in ways that are difficult to anticipate or control. One implication is the entrenchment of strategic competition. NATO's actions, shaped by its initial assumptions, contributed to an environment in which other actors recalibrated their own strategies. These recalibrations were not necessarily aggressive, but they reflected a reassessment of relative power and risk. Over time, such adjustments can harden into enduring patterns of rivalry. The result is not inevitable conflict, but a higher baseline of tension that constrains diplomatic flexibility. Institutional credibility is also at stake. NATO's credibility depends on consistency between its signals and its behavior. When the alliance signals restraint but gradually expands its footprint or scope, observers may perceive inconsistency. This perception can undermine trust even if NATO's intentions remain defensive. Structural realism suggests that credibility is less about rhetoric than about predictability. When actions appear to deviate from expectations, uncertainty increases, and with it the likelihood of miscalculation. Another long-term effect concerns alliance cohesion. Internally, NATO members may draw different lessons from the same experience. Some may interpret the costs incurred as evidence that greater firmness is required. Others may conclude that restraint should have gone further. These divergent interpretations constrain consensus, especially as the strategic environment evolves. While NATO has historically managed internal ikhtilaf, persistent ambiguity about threats and responses can complicate future decision-making. The broader international system is also affected. NATO's behavior influences how other states think about alliance formation and security guarantees. If the alliance appears locked into certain commitments with limited flexibility, potential partners may reassess the benefits and risks of alignment. Conversely, states outside the alliance may invest more heavily in autonomous capabilities or alternative partnerships, anticipating that NATO's room for maneuver is constrained. Looking ahead, realism emphasizes what actors are likely to do, not what they ought to do. NATO is likely to continue adjusting incrementally, balancing reassurance with deterrence. Large-scale reversals are improbable because of sunk costs and political commitments. External actors, for their part, are likely to hedge, seeking to avoid direct confrontation while preparing for less favorable scenarios. This mutual hedging can stabilize relations in the short term, but also perpetuate mistrust. The strategic costs that are now locked in are therefore not fixed outcomes, but constrained trajectories. Options remain, but they are narrower than they might have been had the initial signal been interpreted differently. This narrowing reflects a classic realist problem. Once states commit to a particular path, reversing course can appear more risky than continuing, even if the original assumptions were flawed. A sober analytical observation follows from this assessment. International politics often punishes misinterpretation not through dramatic failure, but through gradual loss of flexibility. NATO's experience suggests that alliances must continually reassess how their signals are received, not merely how they are intended. Structural conditions change, and institutions that fail to adapt their interpretive frameworks risk embedding costs that persist long after the original decision makers have moved on. In this sense, the episode underscores a central realist insight about international order. Stability depends not on perfect foresight, but on the ability to adjust before assumptions harden into constraints. When signals are misread and acted upon, the resulting structures can endure, shaping behavior in ways that no single actor fully controls. The costs, once embedded, become part of the strategic environment itself.